Good evening. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see you here in Ackerman Hall and those that are joining us on Zoom. I'm Ruth Allen, the curator of Greek and Roman art here at the Michael C. Carlos Museum, and it is truly a pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Lisbet Thoreson, who's joined us from California, is an independent scholar specialized, you'll perhaps not be surprised to hear, in the gem minerals used in the production of glyptic in the ancient world. Her research focuses on 4 subject areas that we will be hearing about this evening: gemstone identity and geographic origin determination, transmission and trade, ancient treatment techniques, and interpreting ancient literature on gems, and how we can match what we learn from that literature with what we know of the chemistry and geology of gemstones today. Lisbet is a scholar that whose work I've admired for a long time, and when I began work on making an impression, the exhibition next door that I hope you've all seen, and if not, I hope you're able to visit, I knew that I wanted to work with Lisbet because it was very important to me to sort of tell a complete story of gem engraving in the ancient world, and a story that began with the geology and the gemology, and really was thinking about the mine as an origin point for the material that was to be discussed in the exhibition. And Lisbet has been a fantastic, generous, and supportive resource to me, not just in the sort of specific facet of the exhibition that we'll be talking about momentarily, but in the general pursuit of putting together an exhibition on gemstones, which is a fairly rare undertaking for many reasons, not least because these are tiny objects that are kind of nightmarish to put on display. But Lisbet very generously agreed to help me with a provenancing research project looking at a selection of gemstones from our collection here at the Carlos, that I was really interested in trying to understand where they were mined. And so the sort of outcome of that research really is thanks to Lisbet's time and expertise and guidance. And I won't say too much more because I don't want to take away from the content of Lisbet's lecture. But I do just want to say thank you for all the work that you've put into this exhibition, which could not have been achieved without. And with that, the floor is yours.
So Ruth, I hope I don't disappoint you now, because I'm probably going to spend more of my time talking about the cultural connection of the materials and how these things relate, because I don't think it's been knit together very well in the past, but hold that thought for another talk. I have to put my glasses on so I can see the audience. I want to say how really delighted I am to be here. This is a really special milestone. That was 17 years in coming. I knew Michael Shubin. He contacted me, found me on the web, and wrote to me and said, "I'd really interested in your work." He found a webpage I had about these interests that I have that Ruth just told you about. And he said, "I'm interested in that kind of work being done in my collection. I have a private collection, a small collection. I'd like to make it available to you to study." And I said, "I'd be delighted." Now, he didn't know that I was 5 miles up the road from where he lived. We thought could have just as well been in different states. So it was very convenient and easy to work. He'd bring me batches of gems and I would look at gems, and then I would photograph them. I would make gem reports. And we had all these ideas to do these provenance projects that Ruth is just now talking about. And he became very ill, and he became very ill quickly. And all that just came to a halt in 2008. We started in 2005. And he was so concerned about where this collection would wind up. And I said, "Well, don't put it don't donate it to a big museum. It'll be in a storage room and never see the light of day." because they have too much material. Find a university that has a nice museum and a nice collection so people can study it. And that's what he wanted, was for people to have access. And so through some acquaintances, he was introduced here to the Michael C. Carlos Museum and made arrangements. He became so ill that his cousin then took over, making sure that this transaction would happen. And so it is with great gratitude and humility that I am grateful to Michael for this generosity and this vision he had, and to Ruth, who is the fulfillment of exactly what he wished for this collection. I mean, he would be no end delighted about that. And he was very worried that that might not happen, whatever promises might be made at the time that you make a donation. So, and to his cousin, Ellen, who dedicated herself to making sure that what he wanted to transpire with that collection would happen. And it was a really selfless, generous thing. She devoted 3 years of her life to. And so I'd like to dedicate this talk to Ellen Karnoff. So now back to my cheater so I can see my talk. So I'm just going to warn you, I have no gift for an economy of words. So I'm going to read a prepared text, or we'll be here till 2 in the morning. Again, it's really about the cultural context of the materials, and I'll try to give you a little of the candy aspect of the materials later on in the talk. So carving gems to make beads and talios and cameos is one of the oldest of human occupations. It was an essential industry in ancient life. Gems were carved not only to adorn jewelry and luxury objects, but also to serve functions of practical utility, such as magical amulets and seal stones used for notarial purposes. They had economic value and were used in statecraft for high-level gift giving and as symbols of prestige and imperial authority. Whatever the intended use, value, or meaning that it served as a medium of artistic expression, the carving of gems, or glyptic, achieved its apogee in the classical world. And in the hands of Greek gem cutters plying their craft in their homeland or traveling abroad, the gems they fashioned into glyptic came to be admired and emulated throughout the ancient world. Now, in the pre-classical civilizations around the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, of which you have some examples here, serpentinite, snowflake obsidian, steatite in the upper left, a beautiful carnelian in the middle, and an amazonite that is Mesopotamian. Amazonite is a type of green feldspar, and that almost certainly came from Egypt, the material that is. So in these pre-classical civilizations in Chalcolithic Cyprus, the Levant, Pharaonic Egypt, Minoan Crete, and Mycenaean Greece, the staples of lapidary craft were rocks and impure massive minerals and mineraloids, such as steatite, chlorite, serpentinites, among many other rocks and minerals. And those little tiny figurines are serpentinites, and they're from the island of Cyprus, and they're Chalcolithic, and they're in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now let's see if I can make this work. But from a very early period, hard stones were also being used, specifically varieties of quartz. Rock crystal and amethyst were the crystalline varieties seen most commonly, and among the microcrystalline quartzes, translucent chalcedonies and agates in a myriad of colors and patterns were used, with the orange to red colored chalcedony known as carnelian, one of the most popular of the chalcedonic quartzes seen in ancient glyptic across almost every culture of the ancient world. Not all of them, but most of them. Jasper, which is an opaque, impure form of quartz, was also popular, not least because it was found in a wide variety of saturated colors and interesting patterns, sometimes variegated, sometimes with chunks of jasper interspersed in a matrix of chalcedony and agate. In addition to being an attractive and versatile carving material, quartz was ideal for making crisp, finely detailed engravings that impressed cleanly into wax or clay and did not stick into the stone. And the making of seal stones was a very important industry in ancient life. All of these, Well, the two cylinder seals on the left are from Mesopotamian cultures. I think it's Neo-Babylonian or Old Babylonian I have, and Neo-Syrian on the left. And on the right is from the cemetery at Ur, another Mesopotamian culture dated to 2150 to 2000 BCE. And these are Harappan beads. They were made in northwestern or Indus Valley, northwestern India or Indus Valley by the Harappan culture of the Indus Valley civilization. They were famed for making these very long carnelian beads, and they had developed this incredible technology for making them. And then the blue beads are lapis lazuli, only one known place that was available to ancient gem cutters. And it's still it's probably the oldest working mine in human history, and that is the lapis lazuli mine at the Sari Sang mines in the Hindu Kush region of Badakhshan province in Afghanistan. So the problem for the cultures, let's see here, that had a lapidary tradition that were based around the Aegean, the Eastern Mediterranean, and in Mesopotamia, is that they all lacked locally sourced microcrystalline quartz of good carving quality. So in these regions, in all cultures through all time, gem cutters had to rely on distant resources to supply them with the quality of materials suitable to their needs. This meant the long distance trade routes and trade networks were established at a very early date, around the mid-3rd millennium BCE. And here you see I highlighted the three major civilizations of the prehistoric period: the Egypt, the Indus Valley civilization, and then Mesopotamia, which you don't see highlighted, but certainly important, Cyprus in the Mediterranean, and Minoan Crete, and of course the Hellenic culture in mainland Greece, the Mycenaean culture. So now among the oldest reliable sources of carving quality and attractive quartzes were Egypt, with most mining located in the Eastern Desert, dates to the Middle Kingdom. In northwestern Anatolia or Turkey, and you'll hear me say Anatolia through this talk more than Turkey. I mean Turkey. In Turkey, it's northwestern Turkey primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in Katakoy, which is ancient Chalcedon, Istanbul province, Çanakkale province, and Eskişehir province. And in India, primarily around the Kathiawar Peninsula in the state of Gujarat. And it is here the Harappan culture of the Indus Valley had established its own sophisticated lapidary industry and helped to develop a network of trade that reached the cultures around the Mediterranean. The nature of these interactions involved more than impersonal bartering over commodities. And this is why really I'm spending the time to talk about this earlier material, because this really sets the stage for all that comes later. The transmission of gemstones was always accompanied by the sharing of trade secrets about lapidary techniques, about how to dye and heat stones to improve their color or their working properties. And with this technology transfer in ancient times also came loan words for naming gems and also naming their colors. And it always went from east to west. So by the classical period, Greeks did what they had always done. They absorbed all there was to learn about the legacy traditions of older cultures in the East, which they revered, and then they borrowed and made from it an art form that was uniquely their own. This was the modus operandi characteristic of intercultural contacts and trade related to the procurement of gems and the production of glyptic throughout the ancient world in all periods. So beginning in the last quarter of the 4th century BCE, new gemstones and gems from new sources began to appear slowly in the Greek gem cutters' stock, where varieties of microcrystalline quartz, meaning chalcedony, carnelian, agate, and jasper, had been so prominent during the Archaic and Classical periods. The military campaigns of Alexander the Great, who ruled Macedonia and Greece from 336 to 323 BCE, reportedly introduced to Westerners new exotic things from distant places that had never been seen before. Ideation with India became so firmly implanted in contemporary public consciousness and in the imaginations of all the rulers who came after him in the Western world. Although gems from the East were firmly associated with Alexander's successful campaign in public imagination, which may have been true, the extant corpus of Greek liptic does not quite square with that representation based on my gem surveys. So, and everything I talk about is in relation to what's actually in the extant corpus. For example, Theophrastus, the Hellenistic philosopher, who wrote the landmark scientific treatise on stones, was about gemstones, mentions a transparent red-colored gem from several different sources, and it's manifestly garnet. However, garnets first appear in Greek cameo carving and intaglio engraving around the second quarter of the 3rd century BCE. Theophrastus was writing at the end of the 4th century BCE. So whatever gems indeed came from the East, including garnets, trickled into the ateliers of Western lapidaries over a period of 40 to 50 years after the death of Alexander, before at least I see a palpable difference that becomes apparent in the Greek gem cutters' repertoire of gem materials. The one exception may have been the microcrystalline quartzes from northwestern India and perhaps central and eastern Iran, owing to the very ancient lapidary traditions and established trading routes that connected them to the cultures of Mesopotamia, and from there to Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean. Lithica is a Hellenistic poem by Posidippus of Pella. He was a Macedonian poet at the court of Ptolemy I Soter and his successor, Ptolemy II. And Lithica resounds the familiar refrain that equated gems originating in Arabia and India with the success of Alexander's campaigns in the East. But by this time, because Lithica was written between about 275 and 250 BCE, so by this time, as Posidippus writes his epigrams, the mythologizing has finally caught up with reality. Gems from new sources, which almost certainly included India, began to be seen really for the first time. So when the first ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt died in 282 BCE, the legacy that Ptolemy I Soter left to his son and co-regent Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, was a stable, secure, and well-run state. Ptolemy II continued as an effective administrator, presiding over a tightly regulated bureaucracy, while also actively engaged in leveraging Egypt's position in world affairs, politically, economically, and culturally. Together with Arsinoe II, his sister wife and co-regent, Ptolemy II created an intellectually vibrant court life in Alexandria. He created the Mouseion to host scholars, poets, and artists in residence from around the ancient world. The wonderful classicist Lionel Casson observed that the rise of the new dynastic kingdoms in the Hellenistic age, especially in Ptolemaic Egypt, brought a new dimension into Greek history, bigness. Not only did large political units replace clusters of little ones, but a widespread common culture came into being. He also remarked that never before in history had such fabulous wealth ever been known. The traditional uses of gems, primarily for sealing, were synthesized into a new form of luxury art, or luxus, which was nurtured in Egypt, but diffused throughout the Hellenistic world and far beyond, both in space and time. This development was associated with the changing repertoire of gems and names given to them. Luxury art and the gems used to make it mutually reinforced this conception of bigness in all of its meanings, which all the Hellenistic kings actively promoted. And in Lithica, Posidippus reinforces this carefully crafted image of prestige, power, and exclusivity, which the Ptolemies projected about themselves. Early in his reign, Ptolemy II sent his envoy Dionysius to northern India to the court of Ashoka the Great, who reigned from 268 to 232 BCE. So he was a slightly younger contemporary of Philadelphus. He was the ruler of the Maurya Empire. Dionysius wrote a report, some of which actually survives. Ashoka controlled a vast territory that reached into northern Pakistan, the same region where Alexander had been 50 years earlier. It is exactly the same place. And to the northwest into eastern Afghanistan. His empire covered a huge part of peninsular India as well. So needless to say, his resources were vast, and he controlled access to critical routes of trade overland and by sea, and of course, a heck of a lot of gem resources. Ashoka also sought productive engagement with his counterparts in the West. Gift giving was a central tenet of political philosophy for the Hellenistic rulers, and that was no less true for the Maurya emperors. Personal and diplomatic gifts involving rings and engraved gems was a standard practice in the Hellenistic kingdoms. But what type of exchanges commemorated this particular encounter is not known, although it was sure to have included jeweled objects and gemstones. What is apparent, however, is that the meeting must have had a very positive impression with productive outcomes for both parties. Ashoka erected rock edicts throughout his kingdom, including 2 in Kandahar, which is in modern Afghanistan. One is inscribed in Greek and Prakrit, and the other is in Greek and Aramaic. These were erected in about 260 BCE. The message of piety in the latter edict, which was a central tenet to Ashoka's pacifist philosophy, for you see he was a Buddhist, was intended for the Greek communities living near the westernmost boundaries of his kingdom. A later dated major rock edict, the 13th, was erected about 10 years later in Garhwal Himalayas of northern India. Actually, there were 13 or 14 rock edicts erected there. And this is the one that is inscribed with the names of 5 Hellenistic kings, including Ptolemy Philadelphus. He was so interested in the Hellenistic kingdoms, he actually knew the distances all the way to the Mediterranean. Ptolemy IV, Philopator's rule from 221 to 204 BCE marked the turning point of a long period of progressive decline for the dynasty. From here on out, Ptolemaic rule in Egypt was bedeviled by poor administration and internecine conflicts among the royal family members, and that did not improve from one generation to the next. Ptolemy VIII Euergetes reigned 163 to 116 BC, had a troublesome, shall we say, non-continuous tenure as ruler of Egypt. He was exiled and then came back. But an extremely consequential thing happened near the end of his reign. The secret of the trade winds over the Indian Ocean had finally been discovered. It made possible Egypt's ability to engage in maritime trade in India. For centuries, Arabian and Indian seafarers ventured up the Red Sea corridor to conduct trade going all the way to Egypt, and they had every advantage in those transactions. This discovery of the monsoonal winds over the Indian Ocean and opening of maritime trade for Westerners was a game changer. And it coincided with a new wave of gems filtering into Egyptian ports from India. And one really does begin to see this in a meaningful way. Another very consequential thing about the reign of Ptolemy VIII, and this is not Ptolemy VIII, this is actually Arsinoe II and Philadelphus, but it'll make sense when I get to the end of this section. The very consequential thing about the reign of Ptolemy VIII was that he established a really close relationship with Rome, which would have had a lasting effect on how Greek art, forms, and ideals were absorbed by the Romans. Hellenistic sensibilities about glyptic were readily assimilated into Roman Republican traditions of gem engraving and developed apace. According to Pliny the Elder, who wrote the monumental opus, 37-volume Natural History, he was the Wikipedia of antiquity. The last book was about gems. And that was published in 79 CE. So Pliny the Elder writes and tells us that Sulla's stepson, Scaurus, whose death date 159 to 89 BCE, was the first Roman to own a gem cabinet or dactylotheca, building his collection from the spoils of Rome's wars prosecuted in the East. He reports that Julius Caesar had 6 gem cabinets, and he attributed to Pompey, one of the generals of the Roman Republic, he attributed to Pompey responsibility for swaying the tastes of the Roman culturati and the public at large, for becoming impassioned about gem arts where they hadn't been so much previously. Pompey had a rabid passion for precious stones and pearls. He was much mocked for it. And he was keenly aware that Mithridates VI, Mithridates the Great, who reigned from 120 to 63 BCE over the kingdom of Pontus, that is the kingdom in the Anatolian littoral south of the Black Sea, had a cabinet of finger rings that was renowned throughout the Hellenistic world. When Pompey defeated the Pontic king in the Third Mithridatic War on behalf of Rome in 65 BC in good Roman fashion, he carried the famed gem cabinet back to Rome. Mithridates slinked away to the northern Pontic, but in 63 BCE, he murdered his nearest family members who were with him, and then he poisoned himself. An ignominious end to a very renowned, long-lived dynasty. Meanwhile, in Egypt, there was a messy succession going on, which eventually brought Ptolemy XII, Auletes, sometimes called the flute player, to the throne in 80 BCE, and it made for an unsteady pretender. He was briefly exiled to Rome from 58 to 55, and as mentioned previously, since the 2nd century BCE, Rome had been intervening in Egypt's affairs. Rome became Egypt's primary creditor, which was setting Egypt on a course to becoming a client state of the Roman Republic. Lacking political capital from the outset of his reign, aggravated by profligate spending, mismanagement, corruption, and crippling debt during his tenure, Ptolemy XII was on the verge of ceding Egypt to Rome's control by the time he died in 51 BCE. This was the predicament of his 18-year-old daughter, Cleopatra VII, that Cleopatra, and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who inherited the throne and became co-regents upon the death of their father. Cleopatra dispatched her brother in 47 BC, along with all the other remaining siblings, so she didn't have to worry about having to share the throne with anybody else. And then she spent the next 2 decades trying to rehabilitate the Ptolemaic dynasty's former glory and fend off Rome from annexing Egypt. She was a very cultured, intelligent woman. She spoke 7 languages, and she was versed in literature and the arts and science. She was a remarkable woman. And there's a wonderful biography written about her by Dwayne Roller. I would recommend it to you. Cleopatra allied herself with Mark Antony, Octavian's former ally, now foe, and future first Roman emperor. Together, the couple tried to forge a future for the Ptolemaic dynasty and Egypt's independence. They lost decisively to Octavian at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Cleopatra returned to Egypt and committed suicide a short time later in 30 BCE. Her 2 youngest children with Mark Antony, Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios, age 5 or 6, were carried off to Rome, and they were paraded throughout the streets in golden chains. And then they were sent to the sister of Octavian to be raised as members of the royal household. When she came of age, Cleopatra Selene was married to Juba II, who was another royal orphan from another famous dynasty, the Numidian dynasty. And he'd also been raised in the royal household from the age of 5. I mean, he was a little older than Cleopatra, Selene. So in addition to being king, he was a geographer, producing the authoritative geography of the known world between the Atlantic coast of Africa and the western coast of India. He became the 2nd most important authority for Pliny the Elder in writing his natural history. The first important on the gems. He was actually the most important authority for all of the volumes for Pliny, but the most important authority for volume 37 was Theophrastus, and on stones. So Augustus installed them as rulers of Mauritania, Rome's client kingdom in North Africa. And Cleopatra Selene set about restoring the glory of the Ptolemies' illustrious history. She modeled the Mauritanian court on that of her ancestors. The gem engraver Nios was among the celebrated artists and intellectuals in residence. The Hellenistic ideals that had become so firmly embedded in Roman values were reinforced during the rule of Augustus. And so what you here see on this slide then is Augustus emulating in form and in media carving of Cameo, a portrait of himself. This is the blackest cameo in the British Museum, and emulating the imagery of the second dynasty in the Ptolemaic line. So the Hellenistic ideals that had become so firmly embedded in Roman values, again, were reinforced during the rule of Augustus. And these were values he carefully nurtured to promote his own authority, quite like all of the Hellenistic kings before him had done. He scrupulously preserved the last living legacy of the illustrious Ptolemaic dynasty embodied in Cleopatra Selene, who had an undisputed claim as a legitimate successor of Alexander the Great. So in this last part of my talk, I'd like to focus on 4 gem mineral groups that really epitomize the transitions that I've been talking about up to now. And we'll start with emerald, the green variety of beryl. This is a picture of what are termed the Olbia bracelets. They were found in a tomb. They're dated to in Olbia in what is modern Ukraine on the North Black Sea coast. And they're dated to about the 1st century BCE. So that's something to look at while I talk. An unengraved emerald in a gold finger ring from a tomb near Thessaloniki was a part of a jewelry hoard dated between 330 and 300 BC. That may be the very earliest attested use of this green variety of beryl. And that Ganymede hoard is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Numerous necklaces and other jewelry dating between the late 2nd century BCE and the late 1st century CE are associated with workshops in the North Black Sea region near Olbia and in the Chersonesus on the Crimean Peninsula. And this is an example of one of these objects that was created over a 300-year period. Much of this sumptuous gold jewelry is set with turbid, poor quality emeralds, as you see in this object. And they're the larger green stones that are set through at the top of the bottom of the bracelet and to the sides of the main central part. The other smaller, tiny inlaid green that you see, this is in the Walters Museum. It says it's chrysoprase. I don't think so. I suspect it's ferrocite. And the little flat inlays are manufactured glass, and around the sides that you can't see are some really lovely amethysts. So so they're all almost uniformly look like this quality, and this is the same quality that of the emerald in the Ganymede finger ring, which is the earliest dated emerald that I know of. I've examined that gem in New York in the Ganymede hoard, and it looks like the material from the Egyptian desert, and so do all of these, although I haven't examined any of these Black Sea production jewelry. The earliest engraved emeralds in the Hellenistic period may be a portrait of a Ptolemaic princess. Oh my gosh, can you do something? Can you make it go away? I think he's listening to my talk. He's going to correct me. I know that person. Okay. The earliest engraved emeralds, the Ptolemaic princess, which is now in Paris, and another royal portrait, perhaps Arsinoe III, now in a private collection. And I've seen a photograph of that, and I would have loved to have reproduced it for you, but I didn't have permission. It is barely an engraving, and it looks like the gaudiest piece of material. It is opaque. It looks so granular. It doesn't even look like a crummy barrel, but it is. But it is. So emeralds appear in glyptic in significant numbers only after the complex of mining areas known as Mons Smaragdus in Egypt's eastern desert came under Roman administration. These mining operations were extensive and they were run in a highly professionalized way. My colleague and friend, Albert Gild, went there this last January to work with a Spanish team. That there's always teams working at Secate. And there was a speleologist on this team, a Spanish speleologist. So he was used to dealing with Roman mines in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And he said, these mines are extraordinary. They're because of the way that they're cut. They're really treacherous to get into. You have to almost shinny, you have to be a healthy person and strong person to shinny down and shinny up into some of these galleries. Others you have to lay very flat because they're not very deep. But he said what was so interesting to him was that he could not find a single tool. There's always tools left behind. There's always stuff left behind. Not one tool, has yet to find one. That is administration. That is when you are working somewhere out in the Eastern Desert. You can't go to the Ace Hardware to go and get a new mallet or a new tool if you need it. It's not so necessarily easy to just make it. Oh, and at its heyday, Secate probably had about 1,000 people living there. It was a town. It was a real town. So prior to Rome's annexation of Egypt, the only evidence found so far of potential mining in the Ptolemaic era are some pottery sherds, 3rd to 2nd century BCE, and these come from Middle Village at Wadi Secate. And by the 1st century CE, mining at the Mons Smaragdus complex of mines was fully large scale. It was industrial operation. And most of the material from any of these ancient emerald mines in this complex was poor enough to call them green emeralds, really, rather than emeralds, or green beryls rather than emeralds. Most have a pale to medium green color with opaque to subtranslucent diaphaneity, and they're chock full of inclusions. Inclusions are anything in a gemstone that doesn't make it clear. So that could be foreign guest mineral inclusions. It could also mean partially healed fractures. Anything that you see that's not clear in a gem is termed an inclusion. Hanko Schwann did an incredible survey of emeralds in Europe, Africa, and included in his mineralogical survey emeralds from Secate. And he's a mineralogist at the Natural History Museum of Netherlands in Leiden. And he told me that he estimated that perhaps only 5% of the emeralds from Secate are even close to being what we would call gem quality by modern standards, which is simply to say that it had a nice color, never mind the inclusions. The earliest dated cabochon and the finger ring from the Ganymede hoard, which I talked about early, probably was a serendipitous find at the time, and it most resembles the material mined at Secate in Egypt, which I mentioned already. And as I mentioned, these emeralds that come from this Black Sea suite of jewelry that date from the 2nd century BCE to the late 1st century CE, they all look like they're Secate material. We would want analysis to get it confirmed, but we start from some point of departure. So what is also interesting about this jewelry is that it shares in common an association with workshops in the Black Sea region is how consistent the gems adorning the disparate objects appear to be and how widely distributed the jewelry is or was. Many of them found in archaeological contexts, and they include Taranto in Italy, Palicastro in Thessaly, Greece, the Black Sea region to the west, to the north, and to the east, and in Eskişehir province in northwestern Anatolia. Now, emeralds were valuable. Nevertheless, after all, I've been the smack talk I've been giving about Cicate emeralds. They were valuable and high prestige gemstones in the Roman imperial period, and they circulated widely throughout the empire. They were often set in gold jewelry as natural prismatic crystals, like you see in this parure. That was from the collection of Derek Content. They're polished, but they're still in their natural crystal shape. And then you see all on the left side, these are all supposedly from Cicate. I mean, supposedly the top and the middle slide are that large crystal in the middle belongs to C. Bothmer. He collected it, and his death belongs to the Egyptian authority. And the smaller one laying next to it, now that would be a real emerald, that beautiful little green crystal. Jim Harrell collected that crystal. Those two cabochons in the bottom were given to me by a gemologist at the GIA because of my interest. And he had said that he had been told, and he had looked at the inclusions, and he's the world leading authority on inclusions in gems. And he said they looked consistent with Cicate emeralds, those cabochons. And there we have a really nice quality emerald in the middle. This is a portrait of Platula from the Severan dynasty, set in a gold fingering. This is from the Shubin collection. It's on display next door, and it's cut from an exceptionally fine emerald. And I'll have more to say about that one in a minute. So only a very small proportion of the Roman emeralds are cut from semi-transparent to transparent crystals of saturated bluish green color. While they're not free of inclusions, and very few emeralds ever are, they're not so densely included that they have a turbid appearance like most Cicate emeralds do. Exceptional crystals were reserved for the privileged classes and royal patrons and the wealthy, and they were frequently engraved with portraits like you see here. There's one really lovely portrait of which I just ran out of time and didn't get, is a Flavian portrait in Boston and of Julia Titi. And the other is this one here in Atlanta, Severan. And they are a really nice representation of the finest quality emeralds that were available in the Roman world. Now, it's not clear whether the better quality emeralds that we see in Roman glyptic, especially the smaller crystals used as beads in jewelry, were from that 5% of high quality crystals that came from Cicate in Egypt, which is what Hanko Schwan told me, or from somewhere else in the ancient world. But some of them, especially the later dated Roman emeralds, which tend to be small in size, have a clarity and brighter blue-green color that is distinctly different from even the better quality Egyptian emeralds. Now, emerald localities are found in all the regions of Alexander the Great's campaigns. I'm not suggesting that he found them or that they were found at that time, but they happen to overlay the same area. In the Rila Mountains in Western Bulgaria, in the Panjshir Valley of Afghanistan, and that's in the Panjshir province, and Mingora Swat Valley, this is the same area where those rock edicts were erected, in Pakistan. And among these localities, any of them could have a potential association with late Roman use. Greek communities had lived there in South Asia, all over South Asia, since before the time of Alexander the Great. So Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India, to me, are really credible sources. But we would want the scientific analysis to back it up, of course. Now, Chuck Fryer and John Koivula, senior gemologists with the Gemological Institute of America based in Carlsbad, California, separately examined several Roman emeralds at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Chuck examined the Ganymede emerald and two others, later dated emeralds in that collection. John Koivula examined several emeralds in the Getty Museum collection in Malibu. Chuck examined the emerald in the finger ring from the Petesio hoard at the Staatliche Museum in Berlin. And the Carlos Museum in Atlanta, of course, the portrait of Platula. And they thought that the inclusions of all of these rings that I've now just described to you, or they've all been finger rings, they've thought that their I take it back. One is set in a bangle bracelet. Two are set in a bangle bracelet. They thought their inclusions, color, and clarity most resembled emerald from northern India in Rajasthan province. And this was also well within the empire of the Maurya at the time that these might have been produced. Now let's move on to garnets. This is my personal favorite. Red garnet beads were cut from small crystals. And are known from dynastic contexts in Egypt and at Ur in Mesopotamia. But the earliest examples of engraved garnets in classical antiquity may be a group of Etruscan scarabs that date between the 4th and 3rd century BCE. But around the 2nd quarter of the 3rd century BCE, garnets really do appear for the first time in Greek glyptic as high-quality crystals in vivid hues ranging from red to purple and orange to brown, with much variability in saturation, lightness, and color, and cool and warm tones, like as you can see here. Some of these are from this collection. Some of them are from the Getty, some are from different collections, including the Staatskunde Museum in Berlin. That little one in the lower right corner that looks so orangey, that's a Groschler garnet from Sri Lanka. It has inclusions that are characteristic, that are diagnostic for Sri Lanka. So, when these garnets appear, they're many of them are cut from very good sized crystals, larger than 15 millimeters in the cut stone, which means that the original crystal was a good bit bigger than that. And others are even larger in size, greater than 24 millimeters in the cut stone. So the rock crystal must have been a pretty good sized crystal. The garnets from the jewelry produced in the Black Sea workshops are case in point, and many of them are quite large, as you saw in that bangle those 2 bracelets from the Olbia hoard. Now, contrasting these large garnets is a group of very small ones dating to the 1st century BCE, when the great German archaeologist Ada Furtwängler identified for their small, round, and convex shape. He grouped them all together. They weren't carved in garnet from the same source. They're different colors. It's really clear they're not related by where they came from, but they seem to be related by their style. Perhaps they are workshop related pieces. And the subjects are wide ranging, with the royal portraits seen among the better quality garnets with exceptional color. This seems to be true of all gems. And one of the earliest dated among them, and for me, I think it's for now, willing to adjust that, is one of the earliest dated is this fine almandine pyrope cameo cut from a large crystal, possibly arsinoe. You see her at upper left. That's now in the Getty Museum. It came from the Ionides collection. And then there are 2 other, I think there are 2 Ptolemaic queens here in the Carlos collection. One is the dark brown orange, brown almandine intaglio, and a dark purplish brown almandine cameo mask, which is on display. And I regret I don't have a picture posted of that. My personal favorite in this collection is that piece. It's just a stunningly beautiful garnet, and that too was cut from a large size crystal. It has a sort of somber color as contrasted against many of these other crystals that are bright, saturated colors. But it really does seem that the material was well matched to a dignified subject thought to be Berenike II. And so that too must have been handled as a special premium value gemstone. Now, garnets have a distinctive chemical composition, which are sometimes diagnostic for their geographic origin. And you take their chemistry together with their inclusions, and sometimes the data can be quite compelling. So by comparing the chemical composition of garnets of unknown origin, that would be the ancient ones, the intaglios and such, against the chemical composition of well-characterized reference specimens from known localities, sometimes it's possible to make an origin determination for these ancient unknowns. Analytical provenance studies have been published on a small number of garnets from classical antiquity. One of the things that Ruth was talking about in her introduction, what is going on here at the Carlos with the 50 or so garnets you have in this collection. They're all almandine pyrope or almandine pyrope in solid solution series. We call that the perovskites. Some of them have a significant Groschler component, so that's borrowed over from the other solid solution series, the eugrandites. Now, over the past decade, Albert Gilg has refined clusters for Greek and Roman garnets based on similar chemistry and inclusion. And to date, these clusters now represent at least 10 different localities or different sources. Only a few so far show chemistry that are a perfect match with garnet localities known today. But then we shouldn't expect that we're going to know all of the ancient mines. Mines get lost and new mines are discovered. Only a few so far show this chemistry that are perfect match, as I said, and they include Garabet in Telangana state and Rajmahal, Jharkhand state in India, Ambilapitia, Ratnapura district in Sri Lanka, and in Bohemia, Wadi Abu, Sudan, and Monte Suimo in Portugal. What the data show fairly well is clustering of garnets within groups amongst themselves that seem to be related to one another by culture, period, and perhaps in some cases workshops. So it shouldn't be surprising that some of the pyropes of the early Roman period fit the data for Monte Suimo, Portugal. This makes sense for a period when Rome was mining gold and quarrying stone all over the Iberian Peninsula. The prospects for other European localities may prove interesting for Roman era gems. Others show similarity of color and inclusion assemblages observed in Indian garnets. And for the Sri Lankan garnets from the Ratnapura district, that is particularly promising as well, in my opinion, because Ratnapura is a historically well-known source of blue sapphire and ruby. Ruby's not, I would say, not a gem of the ancient world. There are a few examples, but there aren't enough to say that it was a commodity of trade in any normal sense. But there are blue sapphires. And the first blue sapphires that appear in the Augustan dynasty, and they're from Sri Lanka. There is no doubt. But there are also some basalt-hosted sapphires that come from somewhere else. And that is we don't know yet where those come from, but they don't come from Sri Lanka. So there's a lot of promise in the prospects for our analytical studies on garnets going forward. Okay, now I'm going to finish with peridot, and I'll try to move quickly so that you have some time to ask questions if you'd like. Peridot is the gem variety of the forsterite end member in the olivine group. The oldest known source of peridot is Zabergad, the Red Sea island located about 81 kilometers from the ancient Egyptian port city of Berenike. Peridot on Zabergad Island was purported to have been discovered during the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who established Berenike, named for his mother, to support the mining operations on the island and provide an alternative, more accessible portage than Myos Hormuz further north on the Red Sea coast. The mining conditions on Zabergad are described by Agathokides of Knidos, writing in the 2nd century BC, who provides perhaps the most detailed and vivid account about ancient gem mining in classical literature. He was the first ancient authority to apply the term topazos to the gemstone mined on the Red Sea island. Why they didn't call peridot topazos and save us all the confusion over the modern gem topazos, which is not this one. They didn't ask me. Okay. So he called the Red Sea island Ophiotis, snaky island. So I guess the first order of business when the island was discovered was to eradicate all of the snakes. Other ancient authorities would call the island by the name Topazos after the gem mined there. And it's interesting, for being such a famously ancient, oldest known source of peridot. I mean, it's been written in every mineralogical book and probably popular gem literature ever. And yet the ancient mining had only actually been confirmed in 2010. So And that was confirmed by Elizabeth Bloxham, who is a ceramics specialist, and James Harrell, who is a geologist. And for the past 35 years, Jim Harrell has been going through surveying all of the ancient rock and stone quarries in Egypt, and also all the ancient gem mines that he can find. He's got a book coming out at the end of this year, the beginning of next year. It's going to be fabulous. But he and Elizabeth Bloxham were the ones who surveyed these ancient mining pits. And based on pottery they found there, they found 2 wells and some pottery, and Elizabeth Bloxham dated them to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. And so here's a photograph of gems, of a view of the beach. And these are the spoil heaps of the tailings of where the mining pits were. And then here is a handful of some of the little peridot crystals that he recovered, and we're analyzing those. So the data attributions of Greco-Roman glyptic carved from peridot corroborates the ancient sources who date the discovery of peridot on Zabradad or Topazos Island or Ophiotis to Ptolemy II. The extant corpus shows that peridot was used in glyptic during the Hellenistic, Roman, and later Byzantine periods, but it was never a common gemstone. Most are intaglios cut from large crystals that exhibit a saturated yellow-green color devoid of any brown overtone. There is a modern mine at the top of the island. It was modern in modern times that stopped in 1958. All that material is characteristically sort of an olive brown or an olive green toned gem, but not so this material that was found at the mining pits at the beach or near the beach. So most of the intaglios cut from the large crystals exhibit this saturated yellow-green color devoid of any brown. Nearly all of them have abraded surfaces, which makes them look like beach glass. And I suspect there are a heck of a lot more peridots of engraved gems in collections that have been misidentified as ancient glass when they are in fact probably peridot. I'd like to find out. So Pliny the Elder describes topazos as being easily worn away by use, and that's true. Peridot is easily etched by body oils, which probably accounts for why almost every single peridot we see in ancient glyptic is so abraded. 2 of the earliest examples are a pair of ringstones, now in Munich. Both depict Aphrodite and are cut from large crystals as biconvex cabochons. The small round cabochon engraved with Ptolemy XII here in Atlanta on display next door may be the smallest in the extant corpus that I know of. And it's really distinctive for its light but very bright yellow-green color. So I think I'm going to wrap up. But this trapezoidal shaped biconvex cabochon was excavated at Berenike. The identical shaped beads, cabochons, were found in Rome at the Horte Leamini in Esquiline Hill. It belonged to the Emperor Tiberius, successor to Augustus. I would love to be able to try to figure out what got carved where and which traveled backwards, because one wouldn't expect a trapezoid bead like that at Berenike to wind up back at Berenike after it had gone to Rome. At least I wouldn't think so. But then again, Berenike was a big city. At its heyday, 10,000 people lived there. So the fortunes of Berenike and Zabradad obviously tracked one another. And when Berenike was finally abandoned in the mid-6th century CE, then so was Zabradad, and it wasn't rediscovered again until comparatively modern times. Okay, so there's much more I would want to say, but I do want to leave some room for questions for you. I wanted to talk about amethysts. You've got some treated citrines here. These are the quartzes. Cameo blanks that have been these came from northwestern India. They were carved at a nearby workshop in northwestern India. And then these same cameo blanks were distributed at at lapidary centers all over India, and they've been found also in Egypt. And these come from Berenike. So here we see this wonderful association being validated by some of these archaeological finds. And the Sri Lankan and Indian lapidaries who were working with the beads at Arikamadu, which was the largest bead center in all of the ancient world, East or West, the entire ancient world, biggest, they were perfectly capable of engraving anything to order, anything you wanted. No, the Romans wanted to engrave their own, but you could make the preforms and the rough outs for us. And so these are coming from a lot of different places. An interesting story. What you see is sort of a desert varnish and alteration product that has to do with burial. That's not an intentional thing. That's a burial alteration product that you see that whiteness on it. Some other beautiful microcrystalline quartzes that become very characteristic for the use in Hellenistic and Roman glyptic. It's a beautiful portrait of Philoteros, the ruler of Pergamon, and that's in the British Museum. That beautiful little variegated jasper is in the display next door. That's in this collection now. And then chromium chalcedonies. We're going to move forward. So at this point, I would say thank you for your kind attention. And if there is time, I'd be happy to entertain questions.
If you have questions, just raise your hand and I can bring the microphone to you so that people on Zoom can hear your questions.
I was interested in what they were engraving those stones with in Babylonia and what they were using to engrave emeralds with in Rome.
So there's a wonderful video next door by Shabdar Shusif, who has worked out the engraving techniques of ancient Greek gem engravers and using the same materials in the same processes with the bow drill. So it was abrasives that were used in the early periods. You only need an abrasive as hard as the material you're carving. It's a I don't know where people get the idea it has to be very much harder to cut to engrave materials. In Egypt for thousands of years, they were carving quartz with quartz grit. They could have had Naxian stone from the Aegean, or there's loads of emery hardness 9 from all over Anatolia. And this was almost certainly used, I would think, in the Mesopotamia. And it was in the Indus Valley civilization around 500 BC that the first discovery of diamond points was made. And these were used for drilling holes, through the beads. And they had actually worked out double diamond splinter points because they found if they used a single diamond point, it made an eccentric drill hole, which of course is not good. And so when you had a double point, it would make a nice, perfectly round drill hole. And this was also seen in Sri Lanka. Then I don't know who taught whom the technique and the tools. And one of the items that's mentioned in the Periplus Maris Erythraea about all the gems that were purchased or bartered from India, adamas. Well, that means invincible stone, hard stone. It could be diamond. If it was diamond, I don't think it was diamond as a gem material. I think it was those splinters that they wanted back home to use to engrave. And Pliny even talks about diamond point by the 1st century BC. But it's a very old known technique. People don't realize it goes back to 500 BCE in the Indus Valley. We owe everything to them.
We have a question from Tyler Holman on Zoom asking, even though hematite is geologically common, do we know where hematite of high enough quality for engraving might have been sourced during the Roman period?
Gosh, I got to look at my map because it's on my map. I can't see from here. So there was hematite. There's the specular hematite, and that's the pretty shiny stuff. So there was a deposit in at least one source in Egypt, and then certainly there was up in the Levant and This is it right here, that one. So it's the rectangular tall one, that's the hematite. Okay, yes?
Where do you find these maps?
She makes them.
Oh yeah, I've been working on these maps for since 1997. And I make them to suit what I need for if I need a cultural overlay, or I'm talking about just garnets, or I'm talking about gems of a particular period. And I regret that I didn't have more suitable maps for this talk. This is what I call my kitchen sink map. And it's got, so I picked the period of time of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, because the corresponding Han dynasty was sort of complementary, and so much was going on. And it was really the heyday of the most gem materials from the most number of places circulating most widely. And I included in this map then the Bronze Age sources, because they didn't always stay the same. Many of them did, but some of them disappeared. They stopped being used or got lost, or I don't know why. But it was useful to me to reference what changed just by seeing them in the same map. It's a little junky to look at, but that was useful. So thank you.
Can I ask, I was curious about, in the emerald slide you showed, there was a strange double ring with a sort of stone between the two rings. I'd never seen anything like that.
Ruth?
Yeah, that's a fairly common Roman ring type where if you like, I guess what we think of as a knuckle duster.
Okay.
Two fingers would be one of each.
Would it be worn by men or women or both? Or?
We don't know. There seems to be a preference amongst women for that combination of gold and emerald, and certainly that example that came with a necklace, so that was part of a jewelry set, we can presume was owned and worn by a woman. And I think that's sort of the impracticality of jewelry is often a way of expressing status, right? You're not needing to use your hands for anything, practical. You're not laboring, so you can wear jewelry that maybe is limiting the use of your fingers. So that's, again, expensive materials, emerald with gold, and then a sort of an impractical object is probably indicating status, and then also gender in that combination.
I know that term, knuckle duster. I have to look that one up.
British term?
I don't know. Does everybody else know the term knuckle duster? I should get out more. Anybody else? Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. And for those of you who are interested in technique, Chavdar Chuchaf will be here the week of November 7th. There'll be programs, both talks, gallery talk, conversation with Ruth, but also workshops that you can sign up for and carve your own gems, just as the ancients did, although you can have an electric drill. So it doesn't take 3 days. Yeah, you can do it in less than 3 hours. So the other thing I want to announce is October 23rd, we have this year's Laszlo Excalibur lecture, and Ken LePatin, who's curator at the Getty Museum, will be coming to speak about all of the people who are involved in gem engraving, from the slaves who mined the stones to the engravers in the workshop. So please join us for that, October 23rd. That's on a Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock. Thank you for coming. Have a lovely night.
Thank you.